On the third weekend in October each year, the historic sites throughout Union County host what's called the 4 Centuries in a Weekend. The name 4 Centuries comes from the fact that these structures and locations were part of our history in the 17th, 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries. From the Revolutionary War front lines to Victorian elegance, from historic cemeteries to the beginnings of commerce and industry until today. Each site has a story to tell about our neighborhoods. The 4 Centuries in a Weekend program offers the opportunity to visit many of the Union County Historic House museums and other locations. My intention for this grant project is to introduce you to many of the historic structures and their contents. This program is made possible in part by a 2022 Hart Grant from the Union County Board of County Commissioners. Hey, my name is Nancy Ori, and I will be your tour guide for tonight. I'm a Berkeley Heights photographer, author, and photography instructor. Since 1998, I have received 6 Hart Grants and the Award of Excellence in the Arts and Humanities from Union County Board of County Commissioners. The word Hart in the Hart Grant title means history, education, and art reaching thousands. Well, I don't know if we're actually going to reach thousands today, but this presentation and images will be available for the county to use however they like into the future, and the Plainfield Library will have it on their YouTube site. The photographs that I will be sharing with you will be from an artistic perspective and feature carefully arranged still lifes, interior scenes, and architecture from the 4 Century sites that I have photographed over the years. It will be an artistic journey through Union County's history. Since 1970, I've been traveling to many beautiful places around the world to photograph on assignment for work, for teaching projects, and for creating images for exhibitions. Years ago, I discovered that right here in my own community, there are wonderful sites to photograph and images to share. I'm always inspired to think about how I can best use my skills to benefit my community. Putting together an artistic presentation of images that would document and honor where I live makes perfect sense. Not every community has history so readily available to them. Most of our 21 towns have their own historic sites. Some actually have several. We often overlook what is right in front of us. It's important to celebrate our local accomplishments in not only historic preservation, but also the creativity of artists in our community. And I thank you for that support. I hope that my images inspire you to visit some of these locations and that you might also be inspired about photography, because this presentation is as much about photography and art as it is about history and education. Visit the Plainfield Library Gallery from October 15th, 2022 to March 11th, 2023 to see my exhibit that will include many more images that were too many to have in this presentation. I will also be doing a Meet the Artist presentation on March 4th at the library to discuss my work in the exhibit and answer any photography questions. As a photographer, I love light and how it defines everything we see around us. The understanding and observation of it is at the core of every successful photograph. The light that I used to make these images was mostly natural light from windows and open doors. All of the older images like this one were shot on film, and I hand printed them in my darkroom. They have been toned with a sepia color to help support the historic nature of the subject. They are all one of a kind since I no longer print in the darkroom. The newer images were shot digitally and manipulated with apps and software to give them a painterly and old-time look. I wanted all of the images to look like they are old photographs, postcards, or paintings. The stories and images that I will be sharing are not only about the things and structures. I wanted to set the mood of livable places. By composing each image on location, I wanted to create a sense that maybe a person just left the room and placed these objects for me to find. Or maybe there is some action that is about to take place in this space, as if these are living museums. I want to spark the imagination of the viewer. My photographs represent my personal interpretation of what was at each location that I had to work with. It is always the process of discovery, interpretation, and illusion that I find exciting about the entire photographic process. Having access to these artifacts has been very exciting. There is nothing like having permission to set up compositions. I was able to arrange items into a setup that worked for me. I'm quite controlling when it comes to good composition and use of light. In some cases, I added a light to bring the brightness level of the room up higher so that I was able to work without a tripod. I must admit that in school, I was never a fan of history. It just seemed like a bunch of dates to memorize. But while working on this project since 1999, I have discovered that there are so many stories, and it's really the stories that make the history memorable for me. There's too many to tell tonight, but maybe I can inspire you to go and be part of the story during the 4 centuries in a weekend, or even on your own. Here is a copy of our county map with arrows to the historic sites to help give you a point of reference as we move through this program. I found this map in a brochure that's available through the Office of Cultural and Heritage Affairs for Union County. It's also available at some of the historic sites. But look at all the locations in our county where you can learn about our history and see artifacts from decades in our past. Instead of talking about each location individually, which would take too long, and that information really can be found in the brochure in alphabetical order for each place. I want to talk about them in groups from different time periods in a more chronological order, so you can see how things changed and grew through a timeline up until today. Our first group of locations, we can say, are part of the early aristocracy, which includes a broad time span of local development for over 200 years. In the beginning, the English government encouraged settlement of the New World. Many families immigrated to Long Island and Connecticut, and then over to what was called Elizabethtown. This new settlement required them to clear the land for their homes and city, and ultimately for the farms. They were looking for self-government and freedom with respect to religious matters. They established our cities first. By the mid-1700s, Elizabethtown grew into a prosperous community of 800 inhabitants. You can see by this list how Elizabethtown became the governing center for our county, as well as the state, with the home of the first governor close by in Union at Liberty Hall. The population kept growing. Many of the leaders of the emerging nation enjoyed life in large homes like Boxwood Hall, Belcher Ogden Mansion, and certainly Liberty Hall, surrounded by gardens and orchards. The port of Elizabethtown eventually grew to be connected by water and stagecoaches to New York and Philadelphia. Boxwood Hall was the residence of Elias Boudinot, who was the mayor of Elizabethtown and served briefly as president of the Continental Congress. The Continental Congress was the governing body of the 13 American colonies and later of the United States of America during the Revolution. It coordinated the colonists' resistance to increasingly harsh and restrictive British rule in 1774. In its 250-year history, Boxwood Hall had a number of famous owners and many famous visitors, including Alexander Hamilton, George Washington, and Jonathan Dayton. You can just picture how someone from the aristocracy could sit at a desk like this and use these quill pens to sign important documents. This early aristocracy era featured large homes with beautiful furnishings. New homes were built along with additions to smaller existing homes to meet the demands of the growing population once the colonial government was relocated from Burlington on the Delaware to Elizabethtown. Lumber came from all of the trees that were removed as the towns grew into cities. Built in 1750, the Belcher Ogden Mansion is one of the finest Georgian buildings in Union County. Georgian architecture is the name given to the style that was current between the early 1700s and early 1800s. A Georgian house is characterized by structural symmetry, as well as the balanced placement of windows and doors, and brick was most commonly used. The Belcher Ogden Mansion was also the home of a series of political leaders over time in Elizabethtown. You could just imagine how they all socialized and talked business in these grand rooms. This was the original residence of Royal Governor Jonathan Belcher. He was appointed by the King of England and served as the chief law enforcement officer in the colony. In the beginning, he had a lot of power, but as time went on, he came face to face with a lot of resistance. Quaker meeting houses like this one in Plainfield date back to the 1700s. They were often multi-purpose buildings of worship, community meeting locations, and schoolhouses. They still hold regular worship services here and advocate for peace and justice for all. Early on, they addressed the issue of slavery and required members to either free their slaves with the promise of continued support or to leave the fellowship. During the Revolutionary War, the Plainfield neighborhood was crossed many times by both the British and rebel forces. For over 200 years, the Quaker opposition to war was expressed by non-participation, for which they suffered fines and confiscation of property for refusing to bear arms and for the non-payment of taxes to support the war. Originally, the only house of worship in the small Plainfield community of about 150 people, the Friends Meeting House now represents one of over 40 places of worship in a city with a population of over 40,000. Liberty Hall in Union is one of my most favorite locations to photograph and definitely worth seeing. I will mention it a couple of times in this presentation since it's not only rich in photographic opportunities, but rich in our county history for decades. Here's the beginning of the story. In 1760, William Livingston, from a prominent family, bought 120 acres in what was then Elizabethtown. For the next 12 years, Livingston developed the grounds, gardens, and orchards, and oversaw the building of a great 14-room Georgian-style home as a retirement home, and moved in with his wife and children. But the peace and quiet he was hoping for with his family was short-lived, and we'll get into more about that later. Historic cemeteries filled with the early settlers and later with the Revolutionary War soldiers can be found throughout the county, but perhaps the most historic burial ground in New Jersey is located at the First Presbyterian Church in Elizabeth. The churchyard dates from 1687 and currently has over 2,000 graves. It's definitely worth spending some time and so interesting to read the inscriptions and see how they stood the test of time. You can see the gravestone in the foreground that's being devoured by a tree, but the stone is tough and still standing there. While life in Elizabethtown flourished into a prosperous community, life in the outlying areas was growing agriculturally. Life on the farms during this era was demanding from the youngest to the oldest person. Together with African and Indian slaves, indentured servants, and immigrants, the landowners and local farmers produced everything necessary to sustain life, including shelter, food, and clothing. The challenges were immense to care for a family, the land, the crops, and the livestock. When you step inside some of these authentic farmhouses, you can imagine some of the challenges of life on an early farm. You can see by the names of the towns that we were talking about sites that are further away from the center core of Elizabethtown. We now see Clark, Scotch Plains, Union, Westfield, Summit, Mountainside, Berkeley Heights, and New Providence. More than 40,000 acres were developed into farmland by about 150 families, starting at the beginning of this era. The early homes were quite simple, as you can see by this example. Dr. William Robinson Plantation Museum in Clark is one of the oldest of the 4th century locations. Dr. Robinson was one of the first known physicians in the area. He immigrated here from Scotland with his family. This house is one of the few examples of the 17th century architecture remaining in the United States. One of the outside features is the overhang of the roof. We had fun converting my architectural images in this program to sketches with a simple software program, and I can answer questions about that at the end. But I like the texture and old-time feeling that these software programs help me to get. And since photography was not available to the average person until the late 1800s, a sketch kind of seemed more appropriate to me. The interior has the original wide floorboards, wood peg rafters that support the roof, and a 20-inch wide beam through the center of the house. It is unusually large for a house of this size. The framework is fitted with notches cut in such a way that the weight of the beam locks them in place. These are all marks of an expert carpenter. By today's standards, life was pretty primitive, which you can see by the artifacts in this photograph. The main living area is what we would call an open floor plan, I guess, but not really what we look at in today's TV programs. This house has the living room, the kitchen, and probably sleeping areas, all being within one space. The beds were made of straw. The food was prepared on an open fire in the fireplace with just a few utensils. Family life revolved around this area. The fire was the only source of heat and the sole means of cooking and baking. It is wide enough to accommodate several cooking areas. These early construction techniques were used in several of the old farm dwellings from this period. The Elizabeth and Gershom frazee house in Scotch Plains is another simple farmhouse style of the 18th century. It is a Union County landmark due to its sheer survival for more than 230 years. One of its highlights was how it ended up in the center of the Battle of Short Hills during the Revolutionary War. Elizabeth, or Aunt Betty as she is referred to, was baking bread for our colonial army when the British approached on their way to the Watchung Mountains. Legend has it that they smelled the bread cooking and demanded the loaves of bread. Aunt Betty refused and said she would only give up the bread out of fear, not out of love. Evidently, this impressed Cornwallis, and he is said to have stated, "Not a man in my command shall touch a single loaf." But instead, they destroyed the farm and took whatever tools and supplies they could find. All of these early era locations are filled with handcrafted tools and items that make for interesting still life compositions. I love the abstract quality that the window light gives to these combing tools that are used to work on sheep's wool. Turning wool from the farmer's sheep into yarn was quite a process and usually handled by the women of the family. Most women of the time were educated at home in penmanship, English grammar, the Bible, and classic literature. They were relegated to the kitchen and raising the family. The Miller Quarry Museum in Westfield is another great example of the 18th century farmhouse. The hearth is once again the center of the home here. This area of the house was one of the busiest places on the farm and in use about 15 hours a day for preparing, preserving, and cooking foods. The house witnessed the entire range of human activity and emotions. People were born and died there. In 1740, Samuel Miller built this farmhouse located west of Elizabethtown along an Indian trail that later became Mountain Avenue. The family owned about 100 acres of land stretching to what is now downtown Westfield. About 40 years later, Joseph Corey purchased the house from Samuel's son, and it remained in the Corey family for another 137 years. Our area of New Jersey was originally home to the Lenni Lenape Indians. They created the first riding trails outside of Elizabethtown before the farmers arrived. The trails were widened by the settlers for their carts and wagons and have since been widened further to become our main roads with lots of traffic. Morris Avenue follows one of the earliest trails. The farmers settled in several areas of what is now called Union. They lived relatively quiet lives until the Revolutionary War. The first Presbyterian congregation of Connecticut farms in Union was established in 1730 before the war. It was a meeting house during the week and a church on Sunday. Connecticut Farms is the oldest faith community in Union, established by Puritan farmers who came from Connecticut. Originally built by Deacon Andrew Hetfield in about 1760, this house in Mountainside was expanded in stages to meet the needs of the Hetfield family during the 186 years that the whole family lived there. It began as a simple colonial farmhouse and then transformed into a center hall Georgian home over time. The structure was saved from demolition and moved twice. It contains the typical colonial kitchen, period furniture, antiques, and clothing. The Lytell Lord farmstead, located in Berkeley Heights, was built around 1760. It was owned by farmer and weaver Andrew Lytell, who lived there with his wife and 7 children. It was passed down through the Lytell family until it was sold to the Lord family in 1867. Surviving through many years, the first floor features a Victorian-style parlor with this hand-painted door detail that was on a standing box that contained sheet music, and I just really love this piece. Upstairs is a child's room containing antique toys and a Victorian bedroom. It is believed that the original house consisted of only 3 rooms on the first floor and an open loft above. The Lord family constructed several additions, and if we can jump briefly to the modern era, the Lord family is of the Lord and Taylor fame. When 2 houses constructed at different locations during the 1840s were joined, the building known as the Saltbox Museum was created. The house got its name because of the sloping roof in the back that resembles the box that used to store salt in those days. You can see by the position of the windows where the 2 houses were joined that the windows are all kind of out of whack in alignment. In 1967, the entire house was moved across Springfield Avenue to its present site in New Providence. Moving houses seems to be something that was not uncommon in the early days, and I guess it was probably easier to move one than to build a whole new one. So the Saltbox house is furnished to represent the typical New Jersey farmhouse of the 1800s with artifacts, products, early furnishing, farm tools, dresses, and these great boots. Everyday farm and city life came to a halt as the battles between the British and colonial troops began. New Jersey, and specifically Union County, became a key battleground for the Revolutionary War. We had more major battles here than any other colony as we fought for our independence from England. The newly developed countryside was ravaged as both British and colonial troops marched through in need of food and horses. Our population was divided on the issues. In some cases, it became neighbor against neighbor. Driven by a desire for freedom, many men left their farms and families to join the American militia forces. The residents who sided with the English were called loyalists. These homes, churches, and the Ashbrook Reservation all played important parts in our history. The daily lives of residents were filled with anguish. Visiting these historic sites will help you learn more about this troubled time and help you appreciate what it was like to have a war in your front yard, literally. You will notice that 2 of these sites even have the word Cannonball in their name, the Osbo Cannonball House in Scotch Plains and the Cannibal House in Springfield. In June of 1780, George Washington and his army were encamped in Morristown during the worst winter of the century. On this map, Morristown is located just west and north of Summit. Washington's soldiers had to build their own huts and endure a serious shortage of food. The weather and lack of food over the winter also cost the army most of their horses, which would hinder their ability to move their supplies to safety. 2 attempts were made to attack Washington's troops and seize their supplies. To do that, the British troops needed to move through the Watchung Mountains. It can be hard for us living in the 21st century to visualize the importance of the Watchung Mountains during the Revolutionary War. Centuries of development and the building of highways have changed the landscape so much. These changes allow us to easily drive over mountains which were once major obstacles to transportation. Today, Route 24 passes through Watchung Mountain, as does Morris Avenue in Springfield and Milburn Avenue in Milburn. For Washington's troops in Morristown, the 3 ridges of the Watchung Mountains provided layers of protection that stretched for over 40 miles. You can see on this diagram how the 3 ranges ran diagonally and separated Springfield from Morristown, except for a small gap in the mountains. If the British troops could make it past the gap, they would have an easy path to capture Washington. Their first attempt to invade and move through the mountains took them as far as the village of Connecticut Farms, which is now what we call Union. Once there, they entered into the Battle of Connecticut Farms. The Americans took a stand while more and more British soldiers poured in. For nearly 3 hours, the men of the New Jersey Brigade stood firm, and the British attempt failed. I shot this image and the next photo in the program at a reenactment of the Battle of Connecticut Farms on the church grounds in Union during one of the 4th century weekends several years ago. I liked the sketch manipulation to take it out of the reality. 2 weeks later, a second attempt began with the Battle of Springfield. The attacking British and Hessian forces consisted of 5,000 troops against the 2,000 Continental and militia forces who managed to successfully keep the invasion from reaching the Watchung Gap. The term Hessians refers to approximately 30,000 German soldiers who were hired by the British Army to fight on their side. They had a savage reputation that was greatly feared by our troops. Today, we would call them mercenaries, but the money to pay them was stolen by the officer in charge. The use of foreign troops provided the British with a ready source of well-trained and equipped troops. Puritan influence from Presbyterian and Congregational churches was strong during this time, and many clergy served in the ranks of the militia and in the colonial army as soldiers and chaplains. One pastor who served as a chaplain was the Presbyterian James Cordwell, who was stationed with George Washington in Morristown. Cordwell was the pastor of the First Presbyterian Church in Elizabethtown. During the second attempt by the British to get to the Watchung Gap, Parson Cordwell was in the front with the American fighters at the Battle of Springfield. Our soldiers were getting short of the paper that they used to wad together and pack the powder and the ball down into their muskets. The parson broke open the door of the Presbyterian church in downtown Springfield. He soon appeared with an armful of hymn books written by Isaac Watts, which he threw out to the troops, saying, "Give 'em Watts, boys, give 'em Watts." The soldiers tore up the hymnal pages to make the needed wadding for their muskets. The resistance was too much for the British. When they retreated, they burned most of the buildings in Springfield, including the church. After the losses at both battles, the British changed their strategy. No more attempts were made to invade New Jersey, and the Battle of Springfield became the last major battle fought in the North. The emphasis of the fighting shifted to the southern states. I made this image at the front door of the First Presbyterian Church of Springfield, and knowing the history that I just described of the hymnals saving the day for our troops, I could not believe that I was seeing this shadow of one of the soldiers on the door. In 1905, the state of New Jersey erected a statue of a Continental soldier on the front lawn of the church, and he stands on a piece of ground that's 5 feet square, and it's the site of the smallest New Jersey state park. The Cordwell Parsonage in Union was the home of Pastor James Cordwell with his wife and their children. While the pastor was away fighting, the British and Loyalist troops moved through Elizabethtown as they were retreating from the battle in Union. They passed the Cordwell's home and shot Mrs. Cordwell through the window while her children looked on. It was believed to be an attempt by the British to punish the pastor. They burned the parsonage, the church, and other buildings. The parsonage was rebuilt 2 years later on its original foundation. Today, the parsonage displays furniture, clothing, personal belongings, and other items relating to families who established their homes in Union. This is an artist's interpretation of Hannah Caldwell's death, and it appears on our official seal of Union County. The music in George Washington's army consisted of a fife or flute and drums. Music was a major part of military ceremonies and communications in the field to signal assembly, prepare to fire, advance from their location, or retreat. The addition of music to ceremonies is continued today and demonstrates the power of music in affecting emotions and patriotism. Sorry, talking too much. One of the few places in Union County untouched since colonial times is Ashbrook Reservation, which played an important role in the Battle of Short Hills. The American forces fought to lure the British and Hessian troops through the Ashbrook Swamp to buy more time for General Washington to get his soldiers back up to safety in the Watchung Mountains. You can actually hike the 13.5-mile trail, which traces the steps of the American Revolutionary War soldiers who engaged the British and fought a running battle across what is now Edison and Scotch Plains. And they called the pass, which, is somewhere near Seeley's Pond, which is at the bottom of my street. But the pass was called the Bloody Gap because it was so hard for them to get through. With so much destruction during the war, we are really lucky to have so many places left to see. The Osbo Cannonball house in Scotch Plains gets its name from the cannonball that hit the house during the war. Inside are 4 furnished rooms featuring paintings, period clothing, and toys. This still life is from the other Cannonball house that's located in Springfield. It's one of the few houses left behind on the main road when the British retreated and burned whatever they could. Years later, they pulled a cannonball out of the side wall that is now hanging outside the house where the hole is. I found these items and arranged them on the bedroom dresser near this crack in the wall. I guess I was thinking about the cannonball hitting the house and making a dent. I like the diagonals of this composition. There's just something about this that I really like. Even though it's a simple image, there's lots of movement for the eye here to roam around the image. This fork display was also there. Interesting to note that during these early times, it could take as long as several hours to prepare and take a simple bath. By the time you heated the water in the fireplace and you had washed your clothes by hand and dried them and maybe ironed them, and then after the bath, you had to empty the water. We take so much of this for granted now, but I think it's worth seeing this stuff for real, and take the kids. The Abraham Clark Memorial House in Roselle is also a very early site from 1705. It burned in 1900, but a replica was constructed in 1941. And we're seeing here again another spinning wheel. The Drake House in Plainfield was a typical New Jersey 1.5-story buildings with 4 rooms and a small kitchen on the first floor and a loft. It was later purchased by the Drake family and updated to the Victorian taste at the time. The downstairs was extended and a library was added. By raising the roof, the loft was made into a music room, and the towers that were built on the left and back of the house completed what we see today. The first floor kitchen, bedroom, and dining room are typical of those homes in the 1700s, while the parlor and furnishings are actually early Victorian. It was at the Drake House that George Washington consulted with his officers during and after the Battle of Short Hills, which was fought throughout Plainfield and Scotch Plains, and really had nothing to do with Short Hills that we know today. Drake and his family were patriots. His 3 sons served in the militia, and their freed slave, Caesar, drove a wagon for the Continental forces. Washington and his officers were often entertained here. This is such a great room, and I love this painting. It's not from the time period, I don't think, but it's such a stately arrangement of furniture. Houses from this era feature rooms decorated in earth tone colors and patterns. This is a detail from the entryway in the Drake House. This is another simple composition that I really like, and I've obviously cropped it long and narrow. I always like things that are in threes, and they add such a nice balance here. And the wallpaper, I think, helps to tie it all together. Back to Liberty Hall in Union. This portrait of William Livingston hangs in the main living room. Livingston served as a member of the Continental Congress and as a general of the band of civilians who rose as a military force against the British. He was one of the most wanted men during the Revolutionary War. Not only was he the head of a large and critical rebel group in New Jersey, but he was also a skilled writer who ended up tormenting the British in the pages of the newspaper called the New Jersey Gazette. The British wanted him captured or dead. There was an attempt to kidnap him when the Hessians invaded his house in Union, looking for him and his papers that supposedly contained information about the Patriot cause. 2 of Livingston's daughters were home at the time. They gathered up some worthless correspondence and turned it over to the invaders while hiding the most valuable ones, including important correspondence with George Washington. The soldiers were still not happy that they did not capture Livingston and took out their frustration on the banister to the 2nd floor, where you can still see the scars from their swords on the handrail. After the war, Livingston became New Jersey's first elected governor, serving for 14 years. He is credited with making the New Jersey governorship one of the strongest political positions in the country. He was also a signer of the Constitution. While juggling the demands of governing, Livingston also managed to pursue his great love of gardening that is still evident at Liberty Hall today. He developed the grounds, formal gardens, and orchards. Definitely worth seeing this place. Susan Livingston Kane, the niece of Governor Livingston, was the wealthy widow of John Kane, a prominent merchant from Charleston. Their relationship eventually linked the history of the Livingstons and the Kanes to the history of Liberty Hall. In 1811, Susan's son, Peter Kane, bought Liberty Hall in trust for her and moved in with Susan, his wife, and family. Peter died in 1828, leaving Susan the head of the household. She remained there with Peter's widow and their 3 grandchildren. They were the first members of the Kane family to live at Liberty Hall. Susan's portrait hangs in the dining room over the fireplace. There's an interesting story about all the lovely china that is meticulously set around this table. In recent years, while renovations and plumbing repairs were being done, a wall was opened to find a full set of English china and glassware that was preserved there from the destruction that took place in the house during the Revolutionary War. The house was on the roadway to Morristown, with the war happening in the front yard. So the beautiful dishes and Tiffany glassware were hidden in the wall for safety and were not discovered for many years later. One of the most interesting things that I found about the Liberty Hall Museum is that it has all of the original furniture, clothing, artifacts, toys, and tools that were owned and used by 7 generations of the Livingston and Kane families, including Tom Kane, one of our former governors. Over the time, the house was expanded to the exquisite 50-room mansion you see today that is run by Kane University. It can certainly boast of its important history to New Jersey and home of 2 governors. After the war and recovery in early 1800, city life in Elizabethtown started humming again. Stagecoaches made regular trips along Kings Highway, which is now St. George Avenue, and along Old York Road, which is now Route 28. The Elizabethtown area became a major manufacturing center and transportation corridor. Industries developed everywhere near water and rail lines to facilitate the movement of goods to the major markets in New York and Philadelphia. 3 major railroads ran through the entire country, opening farmland to development. Horse-driven wagons gave way to steam locomotives, accelerating the growth of towns and cities. The development of Hillside, Roselle Park, Kenilworth, Rahway, and Linden grew in the late 1800s. The growth of industry brought workers and new housing. At locations like the deserted village of Feltsville in Berkeley Heights, you will see the architectural remains of a community that was once populated in part by European immigrants who worked in factories by the river. In 1860, the settlement was reborn as a summer resort. There are now about 10 buildings that remain with interpretive signage throughout the property, and a walking tour would help you understand more about the impact of early industry, trade, and residential housing. It's actually a nice tour, and you can read information along the way. Rahway's Merchants and Drovers Tavern, as well as the Stagehouse in Scotch Plains, were centers for business transactions, elections, public meetings, transportation, hotel. They held elections in these buildings, and of course, entertainment. Inside the rare four-story 1790s structure of the Merchants and Drovers Tavern, you'll find a wealth of knowledge delivered by the volunteers. It houses period rooms furnished with antiques, exhibits about tavern life, and info about early transportation. Continuing our discussion on early transportation brings us to the Fanwood train station, the oldest remaining station in Union County. The railroad played a crucial role in the history of the area from 1874 until the present. From the very beginning, the railroad served its communities with freight and passenger services. Over the years, though, the freight services gradually declined as passenger services increased. This house was one of Kenilworth's original farmhouses. Oswald Nitschke purchased it in 1905 and resided there with his wife and two sons. Nitschke was described as a young German immigrant who worked his way up to success as a councilman and the first foreign-born mayor of Kenilworth. His wisdom, vision, direction, and achievements paved the way for the thriving community that exists today. He was involved in all the major changes to Kenilworth that were characteristic of suburbanization. His lifelong commitment to community service is perhaps best reflected in his message to the council in 1920. And here's the quote. "It is to be remembered that the mayor and council must at all times feel the pulse of the people. Together we must study their needs and, as far as possible, unselfishly administer the public affairs. Nothing short of this policy will do. You must not shirk responsibility. You must not fail in the discharge of duty. You must be real servants if effective work is to be done to improve the welfare of our citizen. Let high ideals be assimilated into the body politic. Then will come a new dawn for a better government." Warrants reading again, probably 100 years later. The Woodruff House is a typical small farmhouse built in 1735 in Hillside. I chose to include it in this era of commerce and industry because of the store that was built on the front of the house. It was an important addition to the little community center for the neighborhood. The shelves are stocked with hundreds of products from long ago and really fun to see, like these little shoes. I just love them. In the beginning, Mrs. Woodruff sold apples and other fruits from the Woodruff orchards. Finally, in 1910, Gilbert Eaton rented the house and store that now bears his name. Many people in the area have fond memories of the Eaton store, as they or their parents went for staples or even candy. There were few centers of community activity in those days, surrounded by a small population. Elections were also run through the store, with everyone having a paper ballot to submit. The little store became a hub for arguments and discussions on how a separate community might be created. In other words, independence from the township of Union. Residents of the area felt that they needed a government closer to them in order to obtain a few modern conveniences like streetlights. The adjacent house is the oldest one in Hillside, but it is new in so many ways, reconstructed and restored so that it can serve as a place of learning our history. The Phil Rizzuto All Sports Museum is also there and houses a collection of memorabilia from the Hillside sports figure and Baseball Hall of Famer. The carefully restored Union County Performing Arts Center opened in 1928 in the heart of the Rawway Arts District. It was originally founded as a vaudeville venue and silent movie house. It is an example of what was called movie palace architecture, designed in a classical style. The movie palace designation means that it is large and elaborately decorated. The Union County Pack does not disappoint, with the huge stage, massive chandelier, and plaster carvings on the walls and ceiling. It fell into disrepair, but in 2006, the Union County Board of Chosen Freeholders invested in a terrific renovation. Although many of these locations, like Deserted Village, were established before our Victorian dates, they're important to our history, is most relevant to our neighborhoods becoming flourishing Victorian suburbs. Rapid industrial growth in the first half of the 1800s gave wealth and leisure time to the emerging managerial class. Victorians idealized rural life, and city dwellers looked to the hills and farms for vacation accommodations. The residents of New York City boarded trains to Plainfield, where they were guests at local resort hotels. Executives of the Central Railroad saw the opportunity for development and promoted housing subdivisions in Plainfield, Fanwood, Westfield, Cranford, Roselle, and Roselle Park. The summertime vacationers became year-round residents with 22 daily trains carrying them to and from the city. As things expanded up the Watchung Mountain, a suburban community was born. The reign of Britain's Queen Victoria influenced life and culture throughout the Western world. The classical ideal gave way to the romantic. The picturesque and complex replaced simplicity and balance. Passion, grandeur, and lack of restraint were expressed in art, architecture, and landscapes. The little house on the Rawway, as the Crane Phillips House is known, was first built about 1840 by Josiah Crane as a honeymoon cottage for his son. The Cranes were the first settlers to come to the Cranford area in the early 1700s, build mills on the river, and establish a farm on the west side of the Rawway River. The property was sold in 1867 to Henry Phillips and his wife. The house offers a glimpse of what life was like for the modest family in the Victorian era of opulence. This was an era of inventions that changed everyday life for the average person. Henry Phillips was one of the first inventors of the modern kitchen hood, and his brother Charles Phillips was the inventor of Phillips milk of magnesia. I found these two items at the Crane Phillips house, and I really could not help to put them together in the same photograph. In 1920, the 19th Amendment legally granted women the right to vote. Achieving this milestone required a lengthy and difficult struggle, to say the least, but victory took decades, but they made it. The House Museum features a collection of Native American artifacts, Revolutionary and Civil War artifacts and guns, along with tools and farm implements, a Victorian parlor, and a Victorian girl's bedroom where I found this doll. I call this image black and white because if you flip the skirt up, underneath is another doll with a white face and a checkered skirt. Construction began on the one-room schoolhouse of the Rawway School for Colored Children in 1844, with funding and support coming from the Quaker group called the Society of Friends. The school had an average enrollment of 35 students. Shortly after it became integrated in 1882, it closed. But a local philanthropist established a trust fund that helped to preserve books and artifacts left from the school. These items are waiting in storage now for the restoration of the newly created African American History and Heritage Center in Rahway. The inside of this building is full of student paintings and political posters. Garden and cemetery planning were expanded from the simple earlier post-war designs. Park-like cemeteries contained a variety of stones and monuments, often decorated with statues and other sculptural embellishments. Beautifully nestled within Newark, Hillside, and Elizabeth, the Evergreen Cemetery is a landmark and final resting place like no other. A rural Victorian-styled cemetery established in 1853. Evergreen Cemetery is a non-sectarian cemetery that sprawls across 115 acres of luscious greenery and nature. Well known for its scenic landscape and the notable persons buried here, Evergreen Cemetery is more than a cemetery. It's an important part of the history of New Jersey and the United States. The Reeve History and Cultural Resource Center in Westfield was built in 1870. The Victorian structure has a rich history. Its owners, Edgar and Ralph Reeve, donated the house to the town of Westfield in memory of their father, William Reeve, who lived in the house for over 50 years and contributed to the development of Westfield. Located on Mountain Avenue, it played an important role in the American Revolution because of the spring located on the rear of the property that was used by both American and British troops. This image is in the living room. It's the newest one that I added to this presentation. I've not had a chance to print it yet, and I got tempted by my software programs, and I created this to look more like a sketch, and I have to say I really like it, and I can't wait to print it. I love this painterly kind of feel that these sketches give to the locations. In the late 1890s, property in Westfield was purchased by the Westfield Golf Club and was converted into a 9-hole golf course, with the main farmhouse serving as the clubhouse. Although they lived around a golf club, Blacks in the area were not allowed membership at the white country clubs during this era of segregation. In 1921, a group of Black investors purchased the property and created the Shady Rest Golf and Country Club, the first African-American country club in the United States. An 18th century farmer used his property, which included what is now Reeves Reed Arboretum in Summit, as a signal station to warn General Washington of the imminent movement of the British over the Hudson River against his encampment in Morristown. In 1889, John Wisner built his country estate and residence, which is now the administrative center of Reeves Reed Arboretum, known as the Wisner House. For an overall landscape plan for the 13.5-acre plot, Wisner commissioned Calvert Vaux, a partner of Frederick Law Olmsted, in the creation of their famous sweeping greensward look. Mrs. Wisner planted the first cluster of daffodils that are now a major arboretum attraction every April. I felt bad putting this image into black and white because when you see it in color, it's absolutely amazing. It's a huge bowl that's just filled with daffodils. Definitely worth seeing in probably the second week in April is when I usually go there. In 1916, the new owners, Mr. and Mrs. Richard Reeves, expanded the daffodil collection, the only arboretum in Union County. Reeves Reed celebrates more than 40 years as a historic public garden and education resource. There were so many locations that fit into this era that I needed a second slide to extend the list. The Victorian era overlaps in dates with the previous discussion on commerce and industry, but most of these locations feature Victorian antiques, clothing from the period, tools, paintings, libraries, and gardens. Twin Maples is a 3-story colonial revival estate house and a well-preserved example of early 1900s suburban architecture in Summit. The front facade has a full-height portico supported by columns in a style similar to our nation's White House. In 1949, the house was purchased by the Fortnightly Club of Summit and serves as their headquarters. The club is a women's volunteer organization committed to the preservation of historic property. Upon entry, you are greeted by a grand staircase that leads to a landing with a large leaded glass window. It was important to have an impressive public entrance in homes of this period. This was a room to receive guests, some of whom would not go beyond to the more private living spaces in the home. Summit became a desirable commuter city and grew as new residents built lavish homes after the Civil War. In 1891, a library was built that later became the Summit Playhouse when the books were moved to a larger building. The Playhouse Association was founded as a World War I relief organization. It is the oldest continuously operated community theater in the United States, presenting hundreds of productions since its founding. In 1960, they added a 120-seat auditorium and converted the original part of the building into the stage. The Ducray School of Arts is the oldest art school in the state of New Jersey. Founded in 1926, the school was originally located in a large carriage house in a residential area of Plainfield. It outgrew its original quarters as it continued to build a reputation for excellence in art education. In 1964, it was acquired by Dudley Ducray and moved to its current location in the Van Wyck Historic Residential section of Plainfield. The Roselle Park Museum displays photographs, documents, and memorabilia related to the history of the area. And last but not least on my list is the William Miller Sperry Observatory that is owned by Union County College and can be found on their campus in Cranford. A sizable donation by the Sperry family was used to build the observatory. It houses 2 of the largest telescopes on the East Coast for amateur use on a weekly basis. I love the blue ceiling inside, so I decided to end our discussion with a very current image and show it to you in color. So that's the end of my story. Thank you for joining us. And these are my, this is my website and my email if you'd like to contact me about future programs, tours. I run international tours. And if you have any questions about photography.